Hello and welcome to a Press Start Australia preview. I'm Ewan, and I'm joined today by Julian, who has had some hands-on time with Dark Souls 3 to release on the 24th of March this year. Julian, you've been playing some Dark Souls. Give us your one-word preview of Dark Souls 3. If you had to sum it up in one word, what would that word be?
I mean, if you had like an actual like hyphen between it, must buy.
Must buy. Okay, well, I'll permit the hyphen. Okay, so you've obviously had a very, very good time with the preview so far. Why was that? Like, what stood out to you? What made it so good?
I think because I've played the preview before. Like I've played the test beta a month ago or so, so I've seen the gradual changes From Software have made. So I found it pretty interesting to see going back to some of the areas that I've played before to see how they've changed it, and they've changed it quite nicely. Like there's some bits where they've completely revamped a whole area and added enemies that weren't even in that area, or like a whole side of a like dungeon has just been remapped and they've added a whole new floor or something. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, on the topic of that, then, like, what makes Dark Souls games so fantastic, and what I particularly like about Bloodborne as well, was the level design. Is there anything you wanted to say about the level design so far in Dark Souls 3?
It's pretty much spot on. Like when you start off, like, because I played the first hour, yeah, like earlier in the week, so I haven't experienced much of it. But from what I've experienced, you start off in like a cemetery, the Cemetery of Ash, and it's basically this whole like destroyed, crumbled castle, and surrounded by like ashy remains of like tree roots and stuff. And it's breathtaking. Like there were moments where I would just stop and pan around the camera and see snowy mountains and castles in the distance that I knew I would eventually be exploring, because the game was showing me the very beginning of the whole world. That's one thing that I've always been fascinated by the Souls series, this rich sense of lore and this rich sense of world building that it was phenomenal. And I've only experienced like 2 areas in my time.
Fantastic. So it's boding pretty well then, by the sounds things. That's very exciting to hear. And I had to ask, and you have played previous Dark Souls games and Bloodborne, and people have obviously made some distinctions between the feel of the gameplay in Dark Souls compared to Bloodborne. People saying Bloodborne is a bit more faster paced. How does Dark Souls 3 feel kind of post Bloodborne? Is it more of your traditional Dark Souls game, or does it have some of that pacing of Bloodborne?
I know this is kind of a whimsical answer to say, but it's a bit of both, because it has quite a fast-paced combat system, but it's still using that strategic, like intricate, like methodical approach that the Dark Souls games have. For instance, there's this boss fight that I had. I can't say his name. I'm trying to like Eudex Gundai. He was like this big sort of colossal knight, and the best way to go around him is to sort of try to run or like dodge roll until you're like behind him and backstab him, and that's very classic Dark Souls. Like I found myself getting back into the swing of using backstabs and using more dodge rolls and stuff than in Bloodborne, where I would just run and gun. So it's like if you're expecting pretty much Dark Souls 2 or the original Dark Souls and just a sequel, you might be a little disappointed, because I felt it was more fast-paced, but I didn't feel it was too fast-paced that it like strayed off from the Souls series and just became Bloodborne 2.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a nice kind of gradual evolution in that case then. So you have faced up some bosses now, which has me kind of curious about the monster design, which is something I've always found particularly incredible about these games. Did the enemies you encountered feel kind of inventive and fresh this time, or were they feeling a bit more kind of rehashy?
Yeah, they felt very distinct, I'd want to say. There were a couple of occasions where enemies, like random, like classic sort of undead soldiers, would all of a sudden just mutate into like grotesque parasites that would be like 10 times as hard to kill and like vulnerable to fire. But
Wicked.
then there were times, which is like really cool and more akin to like Bloodborne than Dark Souls. So there's a bit of stuff where you can tell they've borrowed ideas from like Bloodborne, and it's like gothic aesthetic, but they've still kept to that sort of combat system. Like the boss fight that I fought, it's basically a giant, like a colossal knight, and it's got like a Venetian mask on its face, and it has like a halberd, like a long sort of spear. And the whole trick is when you activate this boss to begin it, you have to like pull out the sword from its chest, and all these worms like crawl back into its back.
And then gross.
Yeah. And then like near the end of the fight, the worms like sprout out and like sort of mutate into him, and he becomes this giant sort of like worm creature. But it's crazy how like messed up that is, and that's very much like Bloodborne rather than Dark Souls. But I still want to stress this to anyone who's worrying about like it being too much like Bloodborne. It's got Bloodborne style enemies so far. Like in the hour and a half that I've played, it's like Bloodborne style enemies, but it's still got that classic Dark Souls combat system. And like the second boss fight I fought, the first two boss fights I fought, they're very different from one another, because the first one's quite sluggish. He has a very wide radius in terms of like his spear, and he can grab you, and that's about it. Whereas the boss fight I fought afterwards, it was, I'm trying to remember the name. Basically, it was a giant, really like elongated creature with like two swords, or one sword was on fire, the other one was like, I think was covered in mist or something, but it like danced around this giant cathedral, which felt very much like Bloodborne, but it was still, like it still felt like I was playing Dark Souls, because the music was more akin to Dark Souls, because Dark Souls has a lot more like coarse, operatic music, where I feel as Bloodborne has that, but it still feels a little bit more gothic, and I know that doesn't sound that different, but there's like a slight difference.
But so it sounds like the tone feels a lot more Dark Souls than potentially Bloodborne.
Some of it does.
Am I interpreting that right? Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah. The only thing that I would say is a bit different is this mutation element that seems to be a big part of the game.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's kind of borrowing the right elements, which has me particularly excited as someone that is more of a Bloodborne fan, or that's, my entry to that sort of style of game rather than Dark Souls. So this is sounding good so far. I'm excited by this, and this is getting me more hyped for the game eventually releasing. I imagine it's as grueling and tough as you'd expect.
Yeah, I won't lie to you. I died several times against the first boss, which in most like Souls games is usually the simplest one. Although I remember in Bloodborne, I spent about like 10 hours trying to beat the first boss, and then easily defeated loads of them. But this one boss was difficult. Again, it's like the older Dark Souls games where you have to focus on strategy, and you have to like try to memorize the enemy's movements. Like I found some of the normal enemies were easy, and then other ones obviously were like incredibly hard, and had like this one character near the second boss fight area. He has this ability where he summons pillars of light all around you, and it's nearly impossible to dodge unless you're some sort of like mage or like an archer if you have like long distance attacks. If not, good luck, because it's really hard. But it's sort of that sort of risk-reward element that's so engaging about the Souls series, and I felt in Bloodborne they utilized that by having the whole revenge system, where if you lost some health, you could get it back by quickly attacking that same enemy right after you lost health. You don't have that in this game. Obviously, like the original Souls games, you have like Estus flasks, which are like your health potions. And a nice thing about that is now they have both Estus flasks and like the mana version, which I can't remember what it is, but the mana version is there as well. And you get the option of customizing how much you want of each. So if you have overall like 10 Estus shards, you can have like 5 like health potions, 5 mana potions, or you can have 7 health potions and 3 mana potions, or all like exclusively one set of health potions. So it's From Software are definitely letting you customize it's like the game as you want to your own playstyle, which is nice.
Yeah, well, that's great. It's nice to see them introducing those new mechanics. Were there any other sort of mechanics that kind of jumped out to you that particularly caught your eye, that appealed to you, or maybe kind of you were a little skeptical of?
Not so far. Like, it's definitely just feels like another Souls game, but like the final one. Like, it doesn't feel like they've added anything that'll be too controversial. It just seems like it's more Souls, like more of the Souls universe, and like a really fitting end to the series. Because one thing that not a lot of like newcomers to the series get is that this is rich sense of lore that you can't really find unless you search for it. Like, it's one of those things where they don't tell you the story. And in this, I beat the first 2 bosses, and then I got to the hub world, which is called the Unkindled Shrine. And from there, that was the first part of like the story, and where I actually started to know what I was doing. So you go to this lady, I think her name's the Firekeeper, and that's how you like interact with her to level up. And the first thing she tells me is that I must defeat several Lords of Cinder, which in the first game, I believe, and if anyone's watching this, they'll probably like correct me, but I believe the final boss in the first game was Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, who was one of the Lords of Cinder. So you're basically finishing what the first hero was supposed to do in the first game. So it is like a very nice final like saga or final like game to fit the whole sort of trilogy. Yeah.
Cool. So you're obviously very excited for it to be released on March 24th. No questions asked there, am I right?
Yeah, I mean, I will say this. When I first played the test preview beta, I wasn't that impressed. If people read my earlier preview article, I was sort of skeptical, but now that From Software have had some time to work on it, I'm very proud to say I'm happy to play it, and I'm really anticipating it. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm with you there. I'm very excited to play it as a newcomer to the series. I'm kind of interested into what it's going to be like and see how I fare, because I didn't fare too well with Bloodborne. That took me a while to get into, but hopefully this time around it'll be all good. Well, thanks for joining us. Thanks for chatting to us about your experience with the game. Obviously, we're going to be covering it a bunch more here at Press Start Australia. So stay tuned for everything more Dark Souls here at Press Start Australia. Until next time, happy gaming.